My name is Cassie and I work for the mill as our wild bird product specialist, and today I'm going to talk to you about some of the bird feeders we sell. So if you've been into our stores recently, you'll see we have a ton of feeder options, which is great if you're looking for a specific feeder. There's generally one that's going to fit the bill, but especially if you're just getting into the hobby, it can be a bit overwhelming because where do you start? There's so many feeders to pick from, which one's best. So today we're going to talk about them. Good thing I will say is regardless of what feeder you start with, you're probably going to be successful. All the feeders we sell are great for a variety of different birds, but they do have their pros and cons, so we'll get into that. So the first one I want to talk about is a platform feeder. This is probably one of the better feeders to start with because it's super easy. Essentially, it is a tray that you dump the seed onto. It's not super complicated at all, and it will attract a large variety of birds, both big and small, especially relative to the seed you put in it, because it's really easy for bigger birds to sit on, it's easy for little birds to sit on. They generally feel very comfortable on this type of a feeder, which is great because they can see all the way around, so they can see any predators. These feeders are also really easy to clean, which is very important. You just kind of dump them out, or in the case of this particular feeder, it has these little trays that you can pull out and dump off or clean. Not all platform feeders are 2 layers. Most of them are just 1 layer that you hang up. I personally wanted one that had 2 layers because sometimes if you have some bigger birds on a feeder, little birds won't come over because it's just a lot of pressure and they're a bit intimidated by the bigger birds. So with this type of feeder, what I have found is sometimes I'll get blue jays on the top and I'll still get some smaller birds down below. This one also has a roof. Not all platform feeders do have roofs. This one just happened to have one. It is nice because it does help keep the seed drier. Obviously, it doesn't have any sides, so it's not going to keep the seed dry 100% of the time, but it helps. So platform feeders are great. However, because they are so good for birds to sit on, they're also really good for squirrels and chipmunks to sit on. So if you really are having issues with squirrel or chipmunk pressure, these might not be your best option because it's really easy for squirrels or chipmunks to get onto these. Even with squirrel baffles, squirrels will still sometimes get onto these feeders. So if you're worried about that, I personally don't mind the squirrels that much because I have another feeder that is squirrel proof, but not the best feeder for a situation where you do have heavy squirrel pressure, unless it doesn't bother you. Big fan of platform feeders. The other benefit to platform feeders is if you aren't confident that you're really ready to get into the hobby full on and you don't want to buy a feeder right away, but you do want to look into potentially starting, platform feeders are really easy to make. Personally, my first platform feeder was an old wooden window screen that I found, and I just put 4 eye hooks in it and threaded some string and hung it up, and that was my platform feeder. I just put the seed right on the screen. So, if that's kind of a low-cost way to start getting into it, and again, you attract a ton of birds with platform feeders. So definitely give that a try if you're looking at a good feeder. Next, we'll talk about our suet feeders. So suet feeders are great kind of bang for your buck type feeders. They are fairly low cost, fairly inexpensive. They don't take up a ton of space, so you can hang them up fairly discreetly. And suet is an awesome food source for birds because it's super high in fat. So especially in the winter time, and really primarily in the winter time, I feed suet all year round, but in the winter is when you'll get the most activity. It's a great energy source for birds. This is a 2 cake feeder, so there's 2 cakes on either side. You can find some with 1 cake. It's got a little door, you open the door, you put the suet in, you close the door. So super easy, and they're very light, so you don't need a heavy duty shepherd's hook or anything to hold them up. They can go on fairly insubstantial hangers. One thing to note with this suet, especially if you have cats or dogs, is again, it's mostly fat, So if your dog or cat gets access to it, they are going to eat it and it won't go well. I speak from personal experience in this regard. I had a piece of a suet cake fall out of my suet feeder when I was on vacation one time, and my dog ate it and had some severe GI upset while I was gone. So I actually have little clips holding my suet feeders. You can sort of see them. Suet feeder doors shut. Definitely something to keep in mind if you do have pets or dogs that just eat anything that they can get their mouth onto. So that's your suet feeder. Next up we have a tube feeder. So a tube feeder is just that. It's a feeder in the shape of a tube. They come in a variety of different sizes and styles. This one actually doubles as a squirrel-proof feeder. It has a little motor in it that I have to charge maybe like every 6 months to a year that will cause this perch to spin if a certain amount of weight gets on it. So anytime a squirrel grabs a hold of this, and I have seen it and it is hilarious, the squirrel spins off. It also has a nice hard top that the squirrels aren't able to open or chew through, and that's really why I got it. I was not particularly concerned about having a tube feeder, but I did want a squirrel-proof feeder. So features of a tube feeder, again, shape of the tube, it'll have perches on it. Some tube feeders will have food ports all over the outside of the feeder, not just at the bottom like this one. These are really great for smaller birds. You won't too often see bigger birds on tube feeders, just one, because they just don't have the space, but two, generally speaking, you can't feed bigger seeds in a tube feeder because the food ports just aren't big enough for some of the larger seeds, and typically bigger birds like bigger seeds. So these don't attract quite as large a variety of birds as, say, a platform feeder because of those reasons, but they're great feeders. This one is hard plastic on the outside, as do many of them, but some will come with a sort of mesh tube that can hold specific seeds such as thistle seeds or black oil sunflower or peanut splits. So with the black oil sunflower and the peanut splits, you will get bigger birds on those specific tube feeders because they can grip on the sides and kind of hammer the seeds out compared to ones with perches on them. But tube feeders are great in that regard, and they do tend to be lower cost feeders. Obviously, if it's a squirrel-proof feeder like this, it is going to be on the higher end of the price range, but just a standard tube feeder can tend to be on the cheaper side if you're looking for a lower cost feeder. And finally, we have a house feeder or a hopper feeder. So again, just in the shape of a house, which is where it gets its name. It'll have a tray and a small opening for seeds to come out of. You fill it up by lifting up the lid, and it's got the whole little well to hold your seeds. They typically have hard plastic on inside, and these are nice because they're generally fairly weatherproof. The seeds on the tray will obviously get wet during the rain, or snow can build up down below, but most of the time the seed inside the feeder stays fairly dry, which is great. Oftentimes these plastic pieces will slide out so that you can clean the feeder. You definitely want to, similar to your platform feeders, you want to be able to clean these out fairly regularly because any seed that builds up in the corners or on the bottom will get moldy after it gets wet, which isn't good for your birds. So these will need routine cleaning out, but these are nice feeders just because they tend to come in a large variety of kind of assorted sizes and colors and patterns. So from an aesthetic standpoint, you'll have a lot of options with these types of feeders, and you also get a variety of birds. Some of the bigger birds won't come to these just because, again, the size. The perches just generally don't have as much room for the bigger birds, and you also are limited in the size of the seed that you can put in these relative to how big the opening is, because again, similar to a tube feeder, bigger seeds will get stuck. So just keep an eye out on that. But you will have to deal with squirrel pressure on these feeders as well. They are easier for squirrels to grab onto and eat from, so just something to keep in mind. But these are also really good feeders. One thing to think about with these is if you are using a hook, it needs to be a stronger hook because these get pretty heavy when you put a ton of seed in them or fill them up. So I have definitely had my shepherd's hook fall completely over with the bird feeder full of seed, likely because a squirrel battled with another squirrel on top of it and pulled it over, but definitely something to keep in mind with these types of feeders. And the last feeder I want to talk about is kind of a free feeder that I sort of discovered on my own. So we moved into our house 2 years ago, and we had this stump that was just in the yard that I decided to keep because I thought it was a cool looking stump. And a couple months after moving in, I decided to put some bird seed on it just because why not? It's basically a platform feeder. And I personally love to encourage natural behaviors in animals while still benefiting by getting to watch them eat seeds. So I took some bird seed and I put it on a stump and I scattered kind of all around it, and the birds have loved it. That's probably the feeder I get the greatest variety of birds on, just because it's much more natural for them. And I put feed on all the little nooks and crannies as well as the top, so I'll get a lot of birds on it and all at the same time. Sometimes I'll put in-shell peanuts on it, and I'll get crows that'll come over and eat off of it, which doesn't bother me because all my small birds will still eat off of my feeders. And there's actually one day where, it was one Sunday morning, I looked out and there was a fox standing on it eating bird seed, which I thought was pretty cool. Obviously I'm feeding the birds, but I'm happy to feed the wildlife as well. So if you do have a tree you need to take down or have a stump in your yard, throw some bird seed on it. You might be surprised at what you get come out. So those are our bird feeders, or most of the bird feeders that we have. If you have any questions or are interested in a particular feeder, feel free to stop by one of our stores and talk to our staff, and they'd love to help you find the feeder that you're looking for. Thanks.